So, when you think of the Old Testament, what first comes to mind? For a lot of us, it's probably a bunch of rules, right? A pretty rigid ancient legal code. But what if that common picture is based on a massive misunderstanding? Today, we're going to dig into a really radical idea, something right at the heart of Judeo-Christian thought, that the most important commandment, the real core of it all, isn't about doing something, it's about listening.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We'll start by looking beyond the letter of the law itself. Then we'll really get into the deep meaning of the Hebrew word Shema. From there, we'll explore what a culture of hearing actually looks like, especially compared to a culture of seeing. We'll talk about this idea of God as a voice and how that concept echoes straight into the Christian tradition. And finally, we'll wrap it all up by thinking about what this all really means for us today. Let's jump in. Okay, first up, beyond the letter of law. We're re-examining the whole purpose of the Torah here. There's this really common idea that the Old Testament is just a big, dusty rule book, a long list of do's and don'ts that Jesus eventually came along to replace with grace. But what if that whole narrative is based on a fundamental misreading? What if we've had the purpose of the Torah completely backwards all this time?
So, here's where we really need to shift our perspective. The common misconception is that the law is some kind of personal checklist for getting into heaven. You follow the rules, you get saved. But that's not really what it was for. The actual purpose was much more practical. It was sociological. Think of it less like a spiritual ladder and more like a national constitution. It's a framework for building a stable, orderly, and just society. Because you can't have a functioning nation, let alone a thriving religion, if everyone's living in chaos. So the Torah isn't just a list of rules to be blindly obeyed. It's a profound set of recommendations for how to live together.
And this right here is so important to grasp. Jesus was a Torah-observant Jew. He wasn't some outsider coming in to tear down the old system. Everything he taught, everything, was fundamentally rooted in Deuteronomy and the prophetic writings. He wasn't trying to cancel the law, he was a master interpreter of it. He was arguing from within the tradition, essentially saying, hey, you've missed the point here, let's get back to the heart of what this is all about. It's a radical recentering, not a replacement.
All right, next section, the meaning of Shema. And this is about so much more than just hearing. So if the law isn't just a rule book, what's at its center? Well, it's this, the Shema. It's arguably the single most important item in the entire Torah. In our typical English translations, words like hear or obey, they just don't do it justice, not even close. This one word, it unlocks an entirely different worldview.
Okay, so what is Shema? It's a Hebrew word, yes, but it's loaded with meaning. It's not a single action, it's more like a three-part process. First, it means to pay focused attention, not just letting sound wash over you in the background, but really, truly tuning in. Second, it means to take what you hear to heart. You internalize it, you let it sink in, you process it, you wrestle with it. And third, and this is absolutely critical, it means to respond in action. So it's this whole cycle: listen, internalize, and then act. It's pretty much the ancient equivalent of what we'd call active listening today. It's a dynamic engagement, not a passive reception.
Now, if the central command is this complex act of Shema, this deep listening and thoughtful response, that kind of throws a wrench in our modern idea of simple obedience, doesn't it? It leads to a really interesting question. So, what is the Hebrew word for obey? Get this, there isn't one, not a direct one-to-one equivalent anyway. The entire language, the entire culture, is built around this idea of listening and interpreting. It's not a top-down, authoritarian model of God says, you do. It's a dialogue. It implies a relationship where you are expected to listen deeply, to wrestle with the meaning, to even argue with the text and with God. The relationship isn't based on blind, unquestioning obedience. It's based on engagement.
Okay, next up, a culture of hearing. Here we're going to look at Judaism's focus on the auditory versus the very visual world of ancient Greece. This emphasis on listening wasn't just some abstract theological idea. It shaped an entire civilization. And you can see this so clearly when you put ancient Judaism side by side with the other major cultural force of the era, ancient Greece. They had fundamentally different ways of experiencing reality.
Think about it. Ancient Greece was all about the primacy of vision. Beauty was in the form, the spectacle. Their gods had physical bodies, they built magnificent temples to be seen, and their philosophy prized clarity and precision. Ancient Judaism, on the other hand, gave primacy to hearing. God wasn't a form to be seen, but a voice to be heard. The relationship was about dialogue and interpretation. Even the Hebrew language itself, traditionally written without vowels, is inherently ambiguous. It's almost designed to be interpreted, to be argued over. It demands a hearing, not just a seeing.
And this isn't just some academic theory. It's built right into actual practice. When Orthodox Jews recite the Shema, they traditionally cover their eyes with their hand. Why do that? It's a deliberate act to block out the most powerful and often the most distracting of our senses, sight. The goal is to shut down the visual world for a moment, to create an internal space where you can focus entirely on the act of hearing and internalizing the words. It's a physical embodiment of that cultural priority.
Which brings us to our next section, God as a voice. We'll look at the nature of divine revelation in this tradition. This whole cultural priority for hearing is deeply reflected in how God is actually portrayed. Throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, when the divine truly reveals itself, it's almost always an auditory experience. It's about what is heard, not what is seen. Just listen to this passage from Deuteronomy. Then the Lord spoke to you out of the fire. You heard the sound of his words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. That's foundational. This is the supreme revelation at Mount Sinai, the defining moment for the entire nation. And what happens? They hear a voice, but see no form. This is exactly why creating a physical image of God is considered such a profound sacrilege. God is not a thing to be looked at. God is a voice to be heard.
And you see this reinforced so powerfully in the story of the prophet Elijah. He's on Mount Horeb, waiting for God to appear. First, there's this powerful wind that shatters the rocks. But nope, the Lord wasn't in the wind. Then comes an earthquake. But the Lord wasn't in the earthquake either. After that, a fire. Still no, the Lord wasn't in the fire. And then, after all that spectacle, all that visual drama, comes a still, small voice. That's where God is. Not in the overwhelming power, but in the quiet whisper that requires you to stop and pay absolute attention.
So moving on to the echo of the word, we're looking at how this auditory principle carries right into Christian thought. Now, it's really tempting to think this is just an Old Testament thing, but it's not. This deep-seated principle of listening, of God as a voice, it doesn't just end. It echoes directly into the absolute foundations of Christianity.
Okay, look at this exchange right before the famous parable of the Good Samaritan. An expert in the Torah stands up to test Jesus. And Jesus' first move isn't to give some new answer. He asks, what is written in the Torah? How do you read it? He immediately puts the emphasis back on interpretation. And the expert answers with the Shema. You are to love Adonai your God. And what does Jesus say? That's the correct answer. He is explicitly affirming the Torah's core auditory command as the right answer.
And then, of course, there's maybe the most profound example, the opening line of the Gospel of John. How does the story start? Not with a vision, not with a form, but with a sound. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The very essence of the divine, the Logos, is equated with communication, with speech, with something that must be heard. This isn't a Greek visual concept, it's a deeply Jewish auditory one, placed right at the heart of Christian theology.
All right, let's bring this all home. Our final section, the modern challenge of silence. Because the big question is, have we lost the art of listening? This is all fascinating ancient history, right? But what does it mean for us, right now, living in our hyper-stimulated, visually saturated world? Well, I think it presents a pretty radical challenge.
Just think about your day-to-day life. In a world that is just a constant flood of visual stimulation, notifications, screens, ads, have we become fundamentally uncomfortable with silence? Radio DJs have a term for it, dead air. It's considered the worst possible thing, a void to be filled at all costs. But aren't we starting to treat our own lives that way? Filling every single spare moment with a podcast, with music, with something to watch, just to avoid the quiet. It's this culture of dead air. We fill our lives with constant noise and activity. We really value active doing over quiet being. The hustle is everything. And this has a huge impact on how we communicate. So often we're not actually listening to understand, we're just listening to form a reply. We're waiting for our turn to talk, crafting our comeback in our head, instead of actually absorbing what the other person is saying. And that kind of mindset, it leaves basically zero room for the quiet, difficult contemplation that's needed to truly hear. Which leads to this beautiful phrase that a rabbi used to describe what Elijah heard. Not a still, small voice, but the sound of a thin silence. Think about that for a second. It's not just emptiness. It's a silence that has a quality, a texture, a thin silence. It's a space that's hard to get to. It requires focus, and maybe even a little bit of vulnerability to really enter into it. And so that's the final question for all of us, isn't it? In our loud, busy world, what might we actually hear about ourselves, about the people around us, maybe about something more, if we could just learn to stop and listen in that thin silence?